Hey guys, Andrew Esquire here with the legal mindset on Stand Your Ground. Now we are not talking about the ground I'm standing on. We are talking about self-defense. We're talking about firearms. We're talking about one of the most controversial issues of the modern era. And we're gonna break it down and separate the facts from the fiction and tell you exactly what you guys need to know about this law. Let's get into the history of Stand Your Ground. Where does it come from? It comes from the Castle Doctrine at its root. Stand Your Ground is a law, but the Castle Doctrine is a principle. It's something that is perceived even before the founding of the United States. That is the concept that your home is your castle. It is your area of refuge. When you flee to your home, there's nowhere else to flee, there's nowhere else to go, and therefore you have a higher right to self-defense in your own home. That's something instinctual to us as humans. And therefore, we codified that into law and also through jurisprudence, that is, through decided cases. So whenever I say jurisprudence, think that is if you look at cases that have been decided and laws that have been passed by the legislature and the governor, you see that the Castle Doctrine is something that applies in almost all 50 states. It allows you, when someone enters your home, to defend yourself with appropriate force if you have a reasonable fear of bodily harm or death. So for example, if someone comes in your house with a gun, it is appropriate to respond with a gun. If somebody came in with a knife, and they were very close to you, that also could be a deadly weapon that can merit a response with deadly force. Now, this is a case-by-case analysis. The situation has to be reasonable, and there are exceptions. It has to actually be your house. You have to be there lawfully. You can't be a trespasser, and you have to be acting reasonably. Guys, that's something key in law. You should always remember a reasonableness standard. A lot of times people will come up with this ridiculous scenario. For example, there was a sheriff that said that Castle Doctrine would allow you to shoot trick-or-treaters if they came up to your door. That's not true. That's not how it works. That's not reasonable. It isn't reasonable for someone to look at a child and think they're threatening you with bodily harm because they have a candy basket. That's not real. You want to look at whether the fear was reasonable. So from this came the Stand Your Ground law. That is, when you're moving around, not just in your house, but let's say in your vehicle, in your workplace, even outside of your workplace, you have the right to defend yourself. Now, typically, before Stand Your Ground laws, the standard was the duty to retreat. That is, when you're faced with bodily harm, you cannot respond with the same level of harm without trying to retreat. Therefore, if you could reasonably retreat, you have to do so. You cannot stay there. And this was widely criticized because it seemed to put the safety of the criminal above the safety of the individual defending themselves. If you're obligated to turn tail and run while somebody has a gun trained on you, well, that's really difficult. You're asking them to not take the shot. So it's something that was highly controversial. So therefore, Stand Your Ground laws were implemented. And they were implemented not just by state legislatures, but by jurisprudence, by cases decided. Now in the modern era, we think of things as left and right. We think of things as heavily liberal or heavily conservative, as Republican or Democratic. But this issue really goes across jurisdictions. Most jurisdictions have some form of either legislation or jurisprudence that backs up the Stand Your Ground principle, that you have a reasonable right to defend yourself if you're in a place where you're lawfully allowed to be with an appropriate amount of force. And this is in the majority of states. In fact, fewer than 10 states have not accepted either Stand Your Ground jurisprudence or Stand Your Ground laws. And there are variances between state to state. So it's always important to check with your local attorney as to the variances. For example, here in Florida, the burden of proof is on the prosecution in order to prove that Stand Your Ground does not apply in Stand Your Ground cases. But this is not the case in every single jurisdiction. But at its core, Stand Your Ground allows you to respond with an equal amount of force. So let's say you're in a fist fight. And let's say the other person in the fist fight is very small and you're very large. You're 100 pounds larger, you're a foot taller. It would not be reasonable for you to pull out, let's say, a baseball bat and try to beat them over the head. That would be an inappropriate escalation of force. But if you're in a situation where, let's say, someone pulled out a knife and you were to also pull out a knife and you're equally of the same size, weight, and your fear was reasonable given the circumstances, that would be an appropriate response because it's an equal response of force. What we don't want to see is a disproportionate balance of force. And oftentimes when the folks who are against stand your ground look at it, they look at it as promoting people shooting first and asking questions later. However, they're forgetting one of the key exceptions for stand your ground. For stand your ground to apply, you cannot be the initial aggressor. You can't be the one who started the fight. It has to be self-defense. It is an affirmative defense to say, I was defending myself. That way, it can apply as a defense rather than as somebody else's defense that they were indeed attacked. So once again, these are all nuances of stand your ground. And you've got to understand that even places like California, yes, California, one of the most anti-firearms jurisdictions in the United States, has jurisprudence that supports stand your ground principles. So when you see in the news, for example, now Ohio, one of the few states that does not have stand your ground law, is about to accept it, potentially, you must think that most other jurisdictions already have, whether or not you've explicitly heard of it or not. I hope that answers your questions on stand your ground. If you have any questions, ask an attorney who specializes in this, perhaps someone who specializes in criminal law, because this often comes up under criminal law precepts in your local jurisdiction, because the procedure can change wildly from state to state as always. But until next episode, this episode is adjourned.